Have you ever wondered what lingers in the dark? What whispers through the cracks of a place long forgotten by the living, yet never truly abandoned? This is the story of Drakelow Tunnels, a place where shadows have their own life, and where the past clings to the present like a cold, dead hand. These tunnels, originally constructed during the dark days of World War II, once echoed with the sounds of industry, a factory deep underground, building engines of war. But after the war ended, Drakelow was abandoned, left to rot in the damp, cold earth. Yet, the whispers never ceased. The shadows never stopped moving. They say the tunnels are haunted, and after tonight, you might just believe it. Last winter, a small group of urban explorers received a rare chance to explore a part of Drakelow Tunnels that had been sealed off for decades. It was an offer too tempting to refuse, and within days, 5 eager thrill seekers found themselves driving into the English countryside, their excitement palpable. The cold wind whipped through the barren trees, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. The group's car, a weathered Land Rover, bumped along the narrow, winding road leading to the entrance of Drakelow Tunnels. Inside, the mood was electric, a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. Alice, a sharp-featured woman in her early 30s with a passion for history, sat in the front passenger seat, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape. She clutched a worn leather notebook filled with sketches and notes on the tunnels. Her obsession with the macabre and forgotten had led her to this point, and she was determined to uncover the mysteries of Drakelow. Next to her, Tom, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, kept his hand steady on the wheel. He was in his mid-30s with a rugged look and a restless spirit. His thrill-seeking nature had driven him to explore some of the most dangerous and remote places in the world. But something about Drakelow intrigued him in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the promise of adrenaline, but the lure of the unknown. In the back seat, Sarah and Ben, a couple in their late 20s, exchanged excited glances. They were the kind of couple who thrived on adventure, always looking for their next big experience. Sarah, with her fiery red hair and infectious enthusiasm, was the heart of the group, while Ben, quieter and more introspective, was the rock they all relied on. His dark, thoughtful eyes often gave away a depth of emotion he rarely expressed aloud. And then there was Jake, the enigma of the group. He was a friend of Tom's from their university days, but no one knew much about him. Tall and lanky, with a perpetual shadow of stubble on his face, Jake had an aura of mystery that made the others both curious and uneasy. He had a way of knowing things he shouldn't, of predicting outcomes with unsettling accuracy. It was Jake who had found the tip about the tunnels, and it was Jake who insisted they go, despite the warnings. As the car pulled to a stop at the entrance of Drakelow Tunnels, the group fell silent, staring at the yawning black mouth of the underground complex. The entrance, once a bustling hub of activity, now looked like the gateway to another world, a world where the light of day dared not enter. Among them were Alice, a local historian with a fascination for the macabre, Tom, an adrenaline junkie with a penchant for the supernatural, Sarah and Ben, a couple seeking a unique adventure, and Jake, their quiet friend who always seemed to know more than he let on. They arrived at the tunnels just as the sun was setting, its last rays casting long, ominous shadows across the entrance. The tunnels loomed before them, a gaping maw of darkness, daring them to enter. And enter they did. They stood at the threshold, their breath misting in the cold evening air. Tom broke the silence, his voice gruff with impatience. "All right, let's get this over with. We've got limited light, and I don't fancy getting stuck down there in the dark." Alice nodded, her gaze fixed on the entrance. "Remember, stick together. We don't know what's inside. and it's easy to get lost. Jake, who had been unusually quiet during the drive, finally spoke up. "Just keep your eyes open and don't trust what you see." His words hung in the air, leaving the others with a sense of unease they couldn't shake. With flashlights in hand and nerves steeled, they stepped into the tunnel, leaving the safety of the outside world behind. The group moved deeper into the tunnels, their laughter and idle chatter gradually fading as the oppressive darkness closed in around them. Their flashlights cast weak beams of light, barely penetrating the thick, musty air. The walls seemed to close in, the silence broken only by the echo of their footsteps. The air inside the tunnels was thick and suffocating, carrying the scent of damp stone and something rotten. Their footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound bouncing back in strange ways, making it hard to tell which direction they were coming from. The walls were lined with rusted metal and decaying wood, remnants of the tunnel's former life as a wartime factory. Sarah shivered and moved closer to Ben. "It's colder than I expected. Did anyone else feel that?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb whatever might be lurking in the shadows. Tom shrugged, trying to mask his own growing discomfort. "It's underground. Of course it's cold. Let's just keep moving." But as they ventured further in, the temperature continued to drop, the cold seeping into their bones. The darkness was almost palpable, a living entity that seemed to pulse with every step they took. And then it started. But it wasn't long before they realized they weren't alone. At first, it was just a sound soft, almost imperceptible. The shuffle of footsteps, just out of sync with their own. Alice froze, her hand shooting up to signal the others to stop. The group fell silent, listening intently. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of their own breathing. But then they heard a faint shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet on the stone floor. Jake's eyes narrowed as he scanned the darkness ahead. "We're not alone," he muttered. Tom snorted, though his bravado was beginning to wear thin. "Probably just an animal, maybe a rat." But Alice shook her head. "No, it's not. Listen again." They did, and this time, the sound was clearer footsteps, just out of sync with their own, as if someone or something was following them. The hair on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end, and she grabbed Ben's arm, her voice trembling. "Let's go back. This doesn't feel right." But Jake stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "We're too deep in now. We keep moving." As they pressed on, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be coming from all around them. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the sound, amplifying it, distorting it, until it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. Jake was the first to stop, his face pale in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The others froze, straining to listen. There it was again, footsteps, coming from the depths of the tunnel, but there was no one else there. They pressed on, but the further they went, the louder the footsteps became. It was as if something was following them, always just out of sight. And then the temperature dropped. The air turned icy, their breath visible in the faint light. Panic began to set in. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. Their flashlights flickered, the batteries struggling to maintain power in the oppressive cold. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, to shift and dance in the periphery of their vision. But whenever they turned to look, there was nothing there. Ben tightened his grip on Sarah's hand. "This place is wrong. We need to leave now." Alice's voice wavered as she spoke, the bravado she had carried earlier now gone. "We're close to the section that's been sealed off. Maybe we should just turn back." But Jake shook his head, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that unnerved the others. "No, we need to see this through. There's something here, something we were meant to find." Tom nodded, though his usual confidence was absent. "We've come this far. We might as well see what's ahead." Reluctantly, the group continued, their nerves fraying with every step. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, until it felt like they were wading through it, rather than walking. Alice, desperate to rationalize the fear gnawing at her, suggested it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But as they rounded a corner, they saw it just a glimpse, but enough to freeze the blood in their veins. The tunnel opened up into a large chamber, the ceiling arching high above them. The walls were lined with old machinery, rusted and broken, relics of a time long past. But that wasn't what caught their attention. In the center of the chamber, just beyond the reach of their flashlights, was a shadow. It was darker than the surrounding darkness, a shape that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It moved slowly, almost lazily, as if it were aware of their presence and was toying with them. Alice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What is that?" Jake took a step forward, his flashlight trained on the shadow. But as the beam of light hit it, the shadow didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to grow darker, more solid, as if feeding off the light. Tom's voice was a harsh whisper. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the shadow began to shift. It stretched out, elongating and twisting, until it was no longer just a shapeless mass, but something more. Something almost human. Tom, in a burst of adrenaline, lunged at the shadow, his flashlight cutting through the dark. But there was nothing there, only the empty tunnel stretching out before them. "This is crazy," he muttered, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But the tunnels had other plans. The shadow twisted again, its form becoming clearer. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid to be human. It had no face, only a void where its features should have been. But they could feel its eyes on them, cold and malevolent. Sarah screamed, the sound echoing off the walls, amplifying until it seemed to come from all directions. The shadow jerked at the sound, as if agitated by it, and began to move toward them, its steps slow and deliberate. Tom grabbed Alice's arm, pulling her back toward the entrance. "Run! We have to get out of here!" As they turned to leave, the footsteps grew louder, more insistent, until they were surrounded by the sound. And then, one by one, the flashlights began to flicker. The darkness pressed in, and the shadows began to move again, this time closer. The group broke into a run, their footsteps pounding against the cold stone floor. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the exit always just out of reach. The shadows moved with them, keeping pace, their dark forms twisting and writhing on the walls. Ben stumbled, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. He bent to retrieve it, but as his fingers closed around it, a cold hand brushed his arm. He jerked back, his eyes wide with terror. But when he looked up, there was nothing there, nothing but the shadow, coiling around his legs, pulling him down into the dark. He screamed. The sound cut off as the shadow engulfed him, dragging him into the blackness. Sarah turned back, her eyes wide with horror, but Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "We can't save him. We have to keep moving." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she turned and ran. The image of Ben being swallowed by the shadow burned into her mind. The group was down to 4, but the shadows were still coming. The group splintered, panic taking hold. Alice and Tom ran deeper into the tunnels, while Sarah clung to Jake, tears streaming down her face. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps followed, echoing off the walls, growing louder, closer. The tunnel split into 2, and in their panic, the group separated. Alice and Tom veered to the left, while Jake and Sarah took the right. The tunnel walls seemed to close in, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive, until it felt like it was suffocating them. Alice's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the tunnel, her hand clutching Tom's in a death grip. "We need to find another way out," she gasped. "We can't go back." Tom nodded, his face pale with fear. "We have to keep moving. Maybe there's another exit ahead." But as they rounded a corner, they came to a dead end. The tunnel stopped abruptly, the way forward blocked by a wall of collapsed stone and debris. Tom cursed under his breath, his hands shaking as he turned to Alice. "We're trapped." Alice's eyes were wild with fear as she backed away from the wall, her mind racing. No, this can't be the end. There has to be another way. But as she turned to retrace their steps, the shadows moved, blocking their path. They writhed on the walls, their forms growing darker, more solid, until they were almost tangible. And then they stepped off the walls. It was Alice who broke first. She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably as the shadows crept closer, wrapping around her like a shroud. "We're going to die here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom tried to pull her up, but it was too late. The shadows had her now. The shadows swirled around Alice, their touch cold and invasive. They wrapped around her arms, her legs, pulling her down into the darkness. She screamed, but the sound was muffled by the shadows, swallowed by the dark. Tom lunged forward, trying to grab her, to pull her free, but the shadows were too strong. They coiled around her like a serpent, dragging her down until she was gone, swallowed by the dark. Tom stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. He was alone now, the shadows closing in on him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing off the walls as he fled deeper into the tunnels, the shadows hot on his heels. Jake, too, began to unravel. He started muttering to himself, his eyes wide with terror. "This isn't real. This isn't real," he repeated over and over. But the shadows were real, and they were hungry. Jake and Sarah stumbled through the tunnel, their flashlights flickering as the batteries began to die. The darkness pressed in on them, thick and suffocating, the air growing colder with every step they took. Sarah was crying, her sobs echoing off the walls as she clung to Jake. "Ben is gone," she choked out. "They took him." Jake's eyes were wide, unfocused, as he muttered under his breath, "This isn't real. None of this is real. It's all in our heads." But as the shadows moved, slithering across the walls, Sarah knew it was real. She could feel their cold breath on her skin, hear their whispers in her ears, see their dark forms closing in. In the end, it was just Sarah and Jake left, huddled together in the dark. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. But they knew the shadows were still there, waiting, watching. And then, just as they thought all hope was lost, they saw a faint light in the distance. The tunnel opened up into a small chamber, the walls lined with decaying wooden crates and rusted metal. In the center of the room was a hole, a gaping wound in the earth, from which a dim light emanated. It was weak, flickering like a dying candle, but it was light. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the light. "There's a way out," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. "We can get out." Jake shook his head, his eyes filled with despair. "It's a trap. The shadows want us to go down there." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was already moving toward the light, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the shadows closing in, could feel their cold breath on her neck, but the light was calling to her, pulling her forward. She reached the edge of the hole and peered down into the darkness. The light was faint, barely visible, but it was there. Without thinking, she lowered herself into the hole, her hands gripping the edges as she lowered herself down. Jake hesitated, his mind torn between following her and staying in the relative safety of the chamber. But the shadows were moving, slithering across the floor, reaching for him. With a curse, he followed her, dropping down into the hole. The tunnel they landed in was narrow, the walls close enough that they had to walk single file. The light was ahead of them, flickering like a dying flame, leading them deeper into the earth. But the deeper they went, the more the light began to change. It grew darker, more distorted, until it was no longer light, but a dark, pulsing glow. The walls seemed to close in, the tunnel growing narrower with every step they took, until they could barely move. Sarah's breath came in short gasps as she tried to push forward, but the tunnel was too tight, the darkness too thick. She could feel the shadows all around her, pressing in, suffocating her. But just when all seemed lost, Sarah found something deep within herself, a spark of defiance, of hope. She refused to give in to the darkness. With a final burst of strength, she pushed forward, her hand reaching out to grab the light. The light was warm in her hand, a beacon in the darkness. She held it tight, refusing to let it go, even as the shadows pressed in, trying to snuff it out. She could hear Jake behind her, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he struggled to keep up. But the light was leading them now, guiding them through the darkness, showing them the way out. They moved faster, their steps sure, the shadows retreating in the face of the light. And then, suddenly, they were free. The tunnel opened up, and they were standing at the entrance to Drakelow, the cold night air washing over them like a breath of fresh air. The shadows were gone, banished by the light, and the footsteps had finally stopped. They made it out alive, but Drakelow had left its mark on them. The shadows still haunted their dreams. The footsteps still echoed in their minds. But they had survived. They had faced the darkness and won. The group was never the same after that night. Tom and Alice were never found, their bodies swallowed by the tunnels, their fate a mystery. Jake and Sarah left the country, seeking refuge far from the shadows of Drakelow. But the memory of that night followed them, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just out of sight. As for the tunnels, they were sealed off once again, the entrance barred and forgotten. but the shadows remained, waiting in the dark for the next group of explorers to venture too deep. Drakelow Tunnels remain sealed to this day, a place where shadows live and the past refuses to die. They say that if you listen closely, you can still hear the footsteps, the sound of those who never made it out, forever trapped in the dark. So, the next time you feel a shadow move in the corner of your eye, remember the story of Drakelow and ask yourself, what if the dark is more than just the absence of light? Would you dare find out? Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay in the light, if you can.